Hi and welcome to another booktube video from me, Lauren, from Lauren and the Books. And yes, it's sofa time. David and I, when the clocks go forward, we bring the sofa over here. And I've got to say, it's been here about a week, I'm enjoying it. So yeah, I'm not in my chair now, I'm in my sofa. There is some bird action going on outside the bay window, David. They're going nutty, the birds.
Well, they need to go to the back window.
I bought David a bird feeder for his Easter present. I know it's not Easter yet. And he's absolutely gagging for some birds to come and feed on that bird feeder, and they have got no interest in it at all. That's because they're all at the front, they're all there. Today's video is my March reading wrap up. I'm going to be talking about the 10 books I finished in March, but also, can you hear them? David, just have a look out the window to check there's no birds falling out of a nest or something. Oh, he's gone.
What's that?
There's 2 blackbirds flying around, and I'm concerned something's happened down here that they keep going to. Look, he's coming back. Do you see him? Be very quiet. Action as it unwinds. I'm going to be talking about the 10 books that I've read this month, although it is 11 because I have got... What did you kick that up for?
No, you've pulled it up where you pulled the
Oh! It is going to be 11 because I'm currently... I've just been drying my hair, which is why there's hair caught in it. I am currently on page 576 of this 589 page book, The Great Circle. So I am going to review this at the end, even though I've got 13 pages left, but I still will review it. But let's start with the beginning of the month. So in March, oh God, it's taken 2 minutes to even get to like me wrapping up my books. Thanks for staying if you're still here. In March, the majority of my reading, as always, is from the Irish Readathon and the Women's Prize for Fiction longlist. This first book I read was for the Irish Readathon. This was Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. Tiny little slip of a thing. And I would say, guys, perfectly formed, so wonderful. I'm just seeing how it's 110 pages. This is set in the 80s in a village in Ireland, in an Irish town, sorry, in 1985. And this is set in the run-up to Christmas. We're following a guy called Bill Furlong, who is a coal and timber merchant, and you follow his sort of daily duties and his deliveries and his collecting money from people in a town where there's not so much money going round. And also his visits to one of his clients, who is the church, and what is going on in the church in 1985 in Ireland, and the sort of silences that are coming from the town. This was sort of, despite the subject matter, was still quite sort of, well, I'd say it was one of the words I used to describe it was kindness, because despite the subject matter, it was brimming with this sort of kindness and this sort of warmth and glow. And I didn't know if maybe that was something to do with like Christmas and the sort of fairy lights strung around the town and things like that. The ending was very sort of hopeful, and yeah, I really enjoyed it, despite it being about an awful part of sort of like Ireland's history. Yeah, I was just so surprised at how much sort of connection I felt to Bill, despite only spending 110 pages with him. Like, yeah, I was just blown away by it, really. Very much enjoyed it. Next up was another book I read for the Irish Readathon, and that's Hani and Ishu's Guide to Fake Dating by Adiba Jagirda. I listened to this on audiobook, and this is a love story about 2 very different girls, Hani and Ishu, and as you guessed it, they get together after sort of fake dating. They both have different reasons for wanting to fake date. One of them wants to be head girl. One of them wants to prove to their friends that they are queer. And yeah, I mean, some of it felt a bit sort of like, I mean, I'm not a teenager, so I don't know what it's like to be a teenager these days. I was a teenager, yeah, almost 20 years ago now. So I don't know what it is like to be a teenager, but some of this felt a bit daft. I still enjoyed it. One of the main things I felt a bit daft is that so Hani, her father is running for MP of the area that they live in, and he puts an awful lot of pressure on her being able to sort of like get him the MP job. Like she's out canvassing and helping out like that, and when she isn't able to do it like one Saturday, he's like, oh well, I'm not going to get it now then, and it'll be all your fault. And I thought, God, that's an awful lot of pressure to put on one person, again, my father is not an MP, so I don't know if that is the sort of pressure, but it just felt a bit unkind. Yeah, there's so much covered in this book. Like, I've written down some sort of like themes it covers. So there's like biphobia, homophobia, racism, white feminism, and this is the first of 2 YA books I read this month where I was super impressed by like the topics that they cover and address for YA readers, and are just like very like real and like, this is out there and this is what happened. So yeah, I was impressed with the covering of those things. But yeah, I didn't mind it. I didn't love it, but I didn't mind it. The next up was a book that I did love. Like, I mean, I hoped I would love this, but I really, really did enjoy this. And it's the opposite of Butterfly Hunting, The Tragedy and the Glory of Growing Up. And this is Ivana Lynch's memoir. Ivana Lynch, and trigger warnings in this book for eating disorders, recovery, relapse. Ivana Lynch, you might well know her as the actress who played Luna in the Harry Potter films. And this was a complete page turner for me, which it surprised me really, because I've read many memoirs and quite often I don't find them sort of like big page turners, and like, it's a big old chunky book as well. But yeah, I just couldn't put it down. I found this beautifully, beautifully written, and it does cover, there is some heavy, heavy trigger warnings here for eating disorders and things like that. Like, she goes into big details about stuff like that, and she also talks like about what it was like to live in that moment and how she sort of justified her actions at that time, and the illness, how the illness made her think certain ways. And there's no holding back here. Actually, in the introduction, she sort of talks about how when she sent it to her editor said, oh, is this not a bit cruel? Because she says that throughout this book she's very cruel to herself, and like her actions, the way she treated her parents and her siblings throughout her illness was very, very cruel. And like, it's all in there. And I sort of like take my hat off to her, my imaginary hat, of like the honesty that is in here is so raw and so open and reflective and true, I guess true, I mean, I haven't lived through an eating disorder, but like true to what it actually is to live through an eating disorder, as well as that stuff being in here, and obviously that stuff being a big part of it. Ivana is such a sort of creative and imaginative person. I loved hearing about her love for crafts and her love for, well, her love for Harry Potter really, and I'm not going to get into all the details of it now, because I have sort of, I do not like J.K. Rowling as a person, and since her views on trans people and some other views that have come out from her, I've distanced myself from Harry Potter. I haven't read it since and watched any of the films or anything like that, and that's been tough. But I imagine not as tough as it is to hear the spew that she's spewing out about trans people if you were a trans person. But to relive Ivana's love for Harry Potter before she got the part of Luna, I very much enjoyed hearing about that, and the fact that she joined the cast as like this sort of mega fan, and she was obsessed with Daniel Radcliffe, and she knew like so much about him, and she was like, when she would talk to him, and he sounds like, honestly, like one of the nicest people ever. She said he was so welcoming and so warm, and she did some reading with him for the part before she got the part and stuff like that, and he was just so professional and wonderful. And she like when she's talking to him, she said like her sort of internal monologue was like talking about like remembering what his birthday was and what his mum and dad's names are and what they do as jobs and his brothers and sisters and what his favourite book is and all of this stuff while she's talking to him. And like, I found those bits really funny, and like, as a previous fan of Harry Potter, it was enjoyable to read that from that perspective. So yeah, it made me really, really laugh. But yeah, I just wanted to sort of do a nod to the old, I'm not on board with Harry Potter anymore, sadly. Anyway, I couldn't put it down, and yeah, it was unusual for me to not be able to put a memoir down, but I really, really, really loved this. It is a long one though, and there is a, like I keep saying, very, very heavy warnings for, heavy trigger warnings for eating disorders there, very, very. Then next up was Without Warning and Only Sometimes by Kit de Waal, another memoir, guys. This memoir isn't out until August 2022. Kit de Waal is the author of one of my favourite books, My Name is Leon, which I also read later on in the month, so we'll be talking about that later. And this was her memoir of her time sort of growing up with a mother who was Jehovah's Witness and as a mixed race child in Birmingham, and yeah, it took me a while to get into the rhythm of the writing, and I can't really put my finger on why. And as I got towards the end of the book, when she was sort of like getting a bit older, it made me realise that I was much enjoying the early stages of the book when she was a child. Weirdly, and I don't know if other people do this, but like when I read it, and I mean, Kit's always older than me. This is set in like the 70s, I think, yeah, 1975. And I was born in the late 80s, not the late 80s, mid 80s. When I read things about like people's childhood, I just remember my nan and granddad's house. And like, my nan moved out of that house when I was about 10. So that is like a memory from like 25 years ago. And when I read things about children growing up, I always set them in my nan and granddad's house. And this was in particular, like, she was talking about her father's telly room, and he had a particular seat where he sat, and where the kitchen was located, and like sort of like, and it all just sort of fit so perfectly into my grandparents' house. Maybe that's something to do with like, maybe all houses were built a little bit like that when we were young, like from this age, like, because my grandparents' house wasn't built in the 80s. Yeah, my mum had lived there like her whole life. So yeah, it was I enjoyed the earlier chapters, but towards the end it sort of lost me a bit. But yeah, it also took me a while to get into the writing. But yeah, I think it's because I love My Name is Leon so much. Anything else I'm like, oh, I want it to be as good as My Name is Leon. Then another book by Kit de Waal. Well, this is a book edited by Kit de Waal. This is Common People, and this is an anthology of essays and stories. No, essays, all essays, I think. Working class stories are not, yeah, so essays, poems and memoir from working class writers, and this is edited by Kit de Waal, who also has an essay in here. And this was like a really well curated collection of essays. When I was reading them, they're grouped in sections, not in sort of like chapters, just sort of like the way in which they're placed in the anthology, in a way that they flowed very well and the themes flowed very well, but none of them sort of bled into each other. My particular favourite was the Anita Sethi essay, which was about a trip that her and her mother took to the Lake District as sort of like working class people having never been on a holiday before, and her mum being able to rent out a cottage in the Lake District through work. And yeah, the sort of nature writing in there was amazing. I must read her book. Her women, she's got a collection of essays I think called Women in Nature, and I must read that. But yeah, it was great to sort of like read some of these essays and like all the different parts of being working class and what it's like. So yeah, I enjoyed it very much, and I think it was very well edited. Then I've got Truth Be Told by Sue Diven. Dave's just walking around with his top off. This is the second YA book that I was talking about earlier that covers some really sort of like important issues and doesn't shy away from them, despite this being about YA. So this is set in on the Northern Ireland border, in sort of like contemporary today basically, and we're following two girls, but we're following these two girls who are from generations before, whose parents and grandparents had lived through the Troubles. These girls weren't born during the Troubles, and what sort of effect that's having on them, the young girls, and their parents and their grandparents to this day, which is definitely something I haven't read about. When I've read about books which have been set around the Troubles or things like that, or seen telly programmes, I'm thinking of Dairy Girls, they're set during it, and like to hear about it now and the sort of lasting effects that that's had, that was something that I hadn't read about before. This is like, as I said, there's sort of grown-up themes, or just like important themes covered in here, which I found interesting and like admirable really for a YA book. Things in here, so there's like LGBTQ themes, suicide, terrorism, collusion, but as well as that, there's this, at the heart of it, there's this story about two sisters discovering each other after not knowing they were sisters. And yeah, I really enjoyed that. I really thought it was a well-written piece. And I've got another of Sue Diven's books, Guard Your Heart, which I think it is also set in Derry. So yeah, interesting, very, very interesting, would highly recommend. Then I listened to the audiobook of Again Rachel by Marion Keyes. This is the sequel to Rachel's Holiday, which is actually, I think, I think it might be 25 years. I think it was written 25 years ago, because I've got a feeling it was written in 1997. That is a book that I read, if it wasn't last year, it might have been the year before. I think it was the year before actually, and very much enjoyed it. Like, it's sort of taken me on a bit of a like, oh, there's certain books of Marion Keyes that I really, really, really like, Rachel's Holiday being one of them. So I had high hopes going into Again Rachel, and it didn't disappoint, to be honest. Like, it wasn't Rachel's Holiday for me, but I liked visiting the characters from Rachel's holiday. Also, I didn't realise until I've heard Marion Keyes being interviewed, because at the end of this audiobook, she has an interview with Graham Norton, that there's a whole sort of host of series of books about the Walsh sisters. So Rachel and her sisters, they have other books. So Watermelon, which I was aware of a book of hers that I didn't know followed the Walsh sisters. A few more. This Charming Man, maybe? I don't know. I've put them all on reservation on my Libby app. So yeah, I enjoyed that. But what I will say is, like, you really feel amongst it when you're reading her books. And I thought this about Rachel's Holiday and about Grown Ups. Like, you really feel in the action. It feels so social. And I remember reading Grown Ups right at the beginning of the lockdown and feeling very comforted by this sort of like big social family all meeting up, and so going out with friends and having a chat at the pub about this and coming around for coffee. Like, it feels really, really, really social and friendly. And when I was in the grips of listening to it, I felt like I was surrounded by a whole group of people that I really, really knew well. And she just writes characters so very, very well. And something else she does really well, which I find incredible, particularly with an audiobook, because this is something I struggle with an audiobook, is sort of like chopping and changing between time zones, but it just flows so perfectly. So 1 minute she'll be talking about Rachel and Luke's relationship and how they got together, and then she's talking about Rachel with her new boyfriend now and what that, and like, but none of it feels confusing. It just felt like it just flowed very, very well. Looking forward to it since she announced that she would be making a sequel of Rachel's Holiday, and yeah, it did not disappoint. Very good. But again, trigger warnings for addiction, relapse. Rachel works in a rehab centre, so there's a lot of sort of references to all types of addiction, drug addiction, gambling, alcohol addiction. So yeah, heavy on the addiction themes in this book, but very, very much enjoyable. Then we're on to a couple of books that I read that were on the Women's Prize long list. The first one being The Book of Form and Emptiness by Ruth Ozeki. I really enjoyed this. They're so big. I mean, this is the one that I'm reading at the moment. They're so, the majority of the books that have been on the Women's Prize for Fiction long list, they're all so massive. Like, normally I would have read much, much more than this. But yeah, they're just so big. This one, and also sort of like so big, but also so dense. They're not like, I really had to pay attention in this book. It's not to say I didn't enjoy it, I really did enjoy it. So yeah, this is sort of layered and deep and dense, as I said. We follow Benny, a young boy who's sort of troubled, as you would be, after the death of his father, a sort of tragic death of his father, an unexpected death of his father, and he starts hearing voices in inanimate objects in his home and out and about and things like that. The telling of this story is sort of beautifully done, and though it sort of went to much darker places than I was expecting it to go, I loved the hopeful note that it ended on, and how it was about sort of, in the end, this book that I thought was going to be pure sort of magical realism and Benny hearing voices in a chair and a handkerchief and a board game and a whatever, it ended up being about a big book about mental health and community and libraries and how you might need that community around you and recovery. The bits in there about libraries was really, really wonderful, and the bits in there about book, you hear a lot of Benny's story told from the perspective of a book, which sounds very sort of unusual, but it worked really, really well. And like I said, like, I was expecting it to be all sort of magical realism. I'm not a big magical realism person, but this was the perfect amount for me in here. I find it very odd, I haven't read all of the Women's Prize long list, but this book, so The Book of Form and Emptiness, had a part of the book told by a book. There's another book, Salt Lick, which has got which is told partly from Cow's point of view. There's another book, Creatures of Passage, which has a point of view from a car, and there's like a lot of these books have got points of views from like unusual points of view, like animals or inanimate objects and things like that. I'm into it. So there we go. So yeah, I enjoyed this and I would recommend it. I can't, it's early days to be saying will these sort of things make the shortlist, particularly as I've only read 1, 2. I'd already read 2, 3, 4, almost finished this, 5, and almost finished an audiobook. So yeah, I haven't even read half of it yet. So it's early days, but will this be on the long list? I think so. Next up, sadly, was one that I didn't really enjoy. It was the final revival of Opal Nev by Dawnie Walton. I listened to this on audiobook, and I really, 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 wanted to love this, and when I was reading through the long list I was like, oh my god, I'm going to adore that. To me it sort of sang of Daisy Jones and the Six, and I thought, well, that's going to be so much better than Daisy Jones and the Six. Like I enjoyed listening to the audiobook of Daisy Jones and the Six, but I love the sort of backstory to this as well. So you're following Opal and Nev, who are both musicians, and they're sort of like coming together and how their duo was made and their backstories. Nev being from the UK and being a songwriter and stuff like that, and Opal being from the south of America and being a black woman, and sort of like, yeah, their backstories and what barriers, Nev not really having many, they'd met to sort of get to the point where they are today. But for me, this was all sort of filler and no thriller. I also found the audiobook quite difficult because it's told as an oral history, so almost like a transcript, and they had a cast of people doing it, which is what I really love in audiobooks as well. Like His Dark Materials, I really enjoy the cast they have for that, Daisy Jones and the Six, mentioning that again. But sometimes these people were reading literally like one word or one line, and it just felt really like so we'd be like, Opal Jewel, yeah, I thought that too. Nev yeah, like it just didn't flow. It felt very sort of like and it just flipped between two characters, and that just, yeah, for me it never got going. And like towards the end I did start thinking, oh, maybe I'm enjoying this a little bit more. There's an event that sort of happens halfway through the book, which that bit I really thought was well done, but the rest of it, yeah, it was all, yeah, like I say, I guess like that was the sort of like, not to demean the event that happened, it was a horrific event, but that was sort of like the thriller for me, and the rest of it was filler. And yeah, I just didn't love it, sadly. Next up is My Name is Leon, and this is a book that I've read before. This is a reread, and I listened to the audiobook of this, and this was for book club. I love this book. It is narrated by Lenny Henry, so if you do have the chance, or if you fancy reading it, do give the audiobook a chance, because I think this is probably my favourite audiobook of all time. We follow Leon and his life. He is, at the beginning of the book, he's living with his mum Carol and his younger brother Jake, who's a baby who's just been born. Leon is mixed race, Carol is white, and Leon's new brother Jake is white as well. Carol is unable to take care of Jake and Leon. She has a lot of mental health issues going on, and just and Leon and Jake end up in care. Now Jake is adopted very quickly. He is a white baby, people want white babies, and Leon is put through the sort of foster system. Now he's lucky as far as like his journey in care is. He ends up with somebody who he likes, and the woman who he ends up with loves him and takes good care of him. However, she is in ill health and goes into hospital, and Leon has to go and spend time with her sister, which isn't what anybody picked to happen for Leon least of all. And he sort of makes the best of his experience there, which involves him going to a local allotment and making friends with a sort of two men there, older men, who both have very different backgrounds and like what he sees in them. There's just so many themes going on here, and it's all told through Leon's eyes, and it's just done so perfectly. Like, I'm not a big lover of child narrators in stories, but this is just done amazingly, and he just tells it as it is, like as a child would. And he can't understand why his mum can't, he was basically the caregiver for his mum and the baby. He was going to the shops and stealing food and borrowing money from the neighbours and going and buying food and changing the baby's nappies and making sure Carol had a blanket over her when she slept for like 4 days and on the trot and things like that. And he can't understand why that couldn't carry on. He was like, I was doing all right, I just needed a bit, I shouldn't have gone and borrowed money, because it was one of the neighbours that reported. He said, oh, I shouldn't have gone and, but it's my fault, I shouldn't have gone and borrowed money from that person because we could have carried on. And like, yeah, there's just so much in there, and like all of his relationships he has with all of these people. I just loved it. I absolutely adored it. It's a 5-star book for me. I think previously when I've read it as well, I've given it a 4-star. I think the last few times I've given it 5-star, but I don't think it's ever appeared on like my best books of the year or anything like that, so it might come as a surprise for me to say this is one of my favourite books ever. I wonder what might be appearing on my best books of the year this year if it hasn't done previously. But yeah, and every time I listen to it, I gain a little bit more, or I get a little bit more insight into what it must have been like. It's set in the 80s as well. They're actually adapting it, and Lenny Henry, who does the audiobook, it's coming from his production company, and he is in it. I think it might be sort of like a newish character. I didn't recognise the still I'd seen, the photo I'd seen. I couldn't place who Lenny had played in it, but yeah. Very, very much enjoyed it and would highly, highly recommend. Very, very lovely. And then the last book, as I said, is Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. Now, I am 16 pages from finishing this, but I can't bear to not wrap this up now, because if it goes on to my... It's got to go back to the library, first of all. That's why it's so shiny. But yeah, I have loved this. This has been my favourite Women's Prize book so far. This follows 2 timelines. It's following the timeline of Marion Graves, who is a woman who wants to fly I don't actually know what you would call it. It's to fly a great circle around the globe. She wants to do that, and that is what happens in 1950, and that's sort of like what her life is known for, her attempt at doing this. So we're following her life story, which are bits that I've just absolutely loved from like before she was even born. You're following like her mum and dad's life story, and the baby's she's a twin, and oh my, there's just so much, I could just tell you everything about it. But you're also following a timeline of an actress who is currently filming a film about Marion Graves' life, and she's playing the part of Marion Graves, and the actress. I found those bits just as interesting as well. I've seen a review, or watched somebody's review, where they were saying that they much preferred the stuff about Marion, and they were almost like wishing away the more modern bits about the film being made. But I've enjoyed both of those bits, like particularly the actress who is playing Marion has been sort of typecast into a sort of like Twilight type role before now, so she's sort of like a Kristen Stewart type in a film franchise called Archangel, which sounds a lot like the Twilight series, and before that she was a child star. So I've been enjoying those bits as well. But the writing in here, and sort of like the depths that it goes into, and the characters that are created, it has all just been amazing. I really, really, really loved it. There's moments, there's things in this book that have stuck out to me, like she's talking about one part where she's talking about Marion sort of on the cusp of becoming a teenager, and the turn of phrase she uses is like rattling on the bars of the cage of childhood, like like it's almost there, like teenagerhood is almost there, and she's rattling on there. There's also like moments in here, so when Marion first learns how to, I mean, I guess this is a spoiler, but it's not really, people in this book do die. When Marion is learning how to fly, the guy who's teaching her how to fly, Trout, we go into so much detail about how much he sort of means to her, and what he's done to taught her, like to teach her how to fly and stuff like that. And then literally I mean, it's said very early in the book, like loads of like pilots know lots of people who have died, and his death is like summed up in one line. And I just thought that was so sort of like sudden, as pilots' deaths would be. There's so much depth, and I just absolutely loved it. And unless it completely fucks it up for the last 16 pages, I can't see this not being one of the bestest books I've read this year. Really, really, really enjoyed it. But again, a big old chunker. I've really enjoyed being immersed in it as well. So there we go, the 11 books, 10 books and 16 pages to the end of the 11th that I've read in the month of March. Let me know what you've been reading. Did you take part in the Irish Readathon? Have you been reading books for the Women's Prize long list? And I'll see you all again tomorrow, because it's the first tomorrow, for my April TBR. See you all again soon. Bye!